The golden hues of late afternoon streamed through the towering maple trees that framed a quiet suburban street. Evelyn Monroe adjusted her wide-brimmed sun hat, its shadow shielding her determined gaze. Around her neck hung a delicate gold pendant, a treasured keepsake from her late husband, Robert. Beside her trotted Max, a formidable German shepherd with a sleek coat and an alert demeanor. Their daily walks were a cherished routine, offering Evelyn a brief respite and connection to the neighborhood she had called home for decades. As they strolled past manicured lawns and white picket fences, Evelyn noticed the occasional lingering glance from neighbors. These stares, heavy with unspoken judgments, were nothing new. She met them with quiet dignity, her posture unwavering. Max's tail wagged with rhythmic confidence, a silent reassurance that he was always by her side. "Let's keep moving, Max," she murmured, her tone calm yet firm. The dog's ears perked in response, his loyalty evident in every step. Turning onto Willow Lane, Evelyn's serenity faltered as she noticed a pickup truck slowing behind her. The faint hum of its engine grew louder, the vehicle's shadow stretching ominously across the pavement. She cast a subtle glance over her shoulder. 4 men, all young and broad-shouldered, leaned out of the windows. Their laughter was harsh, their expressions edged with malice. Evelyn's grip on Max's leash tightened instinctively. The dog's posture stiffened, his growl low and menacing. "Stay calm, Max," she whispered, though her own heart pounded in her chest. "That's a nice dog you got there," one of the men called out, his tone dripping with mockery. Evelyn kept walking, refusing to acknowledge them. She focused on the rhythm of her steps, her resolve growing with each stride. The truck screeched to a halt and the men climbed out, their boots crunching against the asphalt. "Afternoon, ma'am," the tallest of the group greeted, his grin cold and calculated. The others flanked him, their eyes glinting with predatory intent. "Where's a lady like you heading so fast?" another sneered, stepping into her path. Evelyn stopped, her grip on Max's leash unyielding. She met their gazes without flinching. "Just out for a walk," she said evenly, her voice betraying no fear. Max's growl deepened, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground. "That's some fine jewelry," the tallest man remarked, gesturing toward the pendant around her neck. "How about you hand it over?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "This necklace isn't for sale," she replied curtly, taking a deliberate step forward. Max mirrored her movement, his body a taut line of muscle and focus. The man's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Feisty, huh? Let's not make this difficult, ma'am. We're just admiring, that's all." "Admire from a distance," Evelyn shot back, her tone sharp. The group's laughter echoed down the empty street, but their bravado faltered as Max barked, the sound sharp and commanding. "Relax, lady," the red-haired man in the group taunted, though his voice wavered slightly. "We're just having some fun." Evelyn's gaze hardened. "Harassing someone isn't fun. You should leave before you regret this." The tallest man's expression darkened, his smirk replaced by a scowl. "Regret. Listen here, you—" Before he could finish, Max let out a thunderous bark, his teeth bared in a ferocious snarl. The men recoiled slightly, their confidence visibly shaken. One of them, emboldened by his companions, stepped closer. "That mutt's all bark," he scoffed. "He won't do anything." Evelyn's voice was cold and steady. "Try me." The tension hung heavy in the air as the men exchanged uneasy glances. The red-haired man muttered something under his breath, his bravado fading. "This ain't worth it." "Shut up," the tallest man snapped. "We're not leaving empty-handed." As he lunged toward Evelyn, Max sprang into action. The dog's powerful body collided with the man, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Max's teeth sank into the fabric of the man's jacket, holding him down with a growl that promised unwavering protection. The man screamed, flailing against Max's grip. "Get him off me! Call him off!" he bellowed, his voice laced with panic. Evelyn remained unmoved, her gaze icy. "I warned you," she said simply. The others hesitated, their earlier bravado now replaced with fear. One of them attempted to rush forward, but Max's bark stopped him in his tracks. "Just a dog, huh?" Evelyn taunted. "Looks like he's more than enough for you." The red-haired man finally backed away, clutching his arm where Max had grazed him during his defense. "Let's get out of here," he urged, his voice trembling. "No way," the tallest man snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're not done." Evelyn took a deliberate step forward, Max standing tall beside her. "You've already lost," she said, her tone cutting. "Now leave before it gets worse." The men exchanged tense glances, their confidence unraveling. Finally, the tallest man relented, pushing himself to his feet. He spat on the ground, his face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed, backing away. Evelyn's eyes didn't waver. Not as much as you will. As the men retreated, Max barked one final time, his growl following them down the street. Evelyn stood tall, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She glanced toward a nearby house, noting the security camera perched above the garage. Its silent lens had captured everything. "Good boy, Max," she murmured, kneeling to stroke the dog's head. His tail wagged slightly, his eyes still fixed on the retreating figures. As the tension dissipated, Evelyn allowed herself a deep breath. This was her neighborhood, her life, and she had no intention of letting anyone take that from her. With Max by her side, she knew she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Brian Tanner struggled against the weight of Eleanor's loyal Rottweiler, Duke, the illusion of his bravado shattered completely. "Get this dog off me," he howled, his earlier swagger now replaced by terror. Yet, his remaining comrades hesitated, their courage dissolving in the face of Duke's ferocious growls and snapping teeth. One of the men took a tentative step forward, but froze, as Duke bared his teeth, a low rumble emanating from his chest like an ominous warning. "Not so bold now, are you?" Eleanor's voice was steady and cold, her gaze unwavering despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Shut up, lady!" one of the men yelled, but his voice lacked conviction. Before he could say more, a distant sound rose above the tense silence, the wail of approaching sirens. The panic on the men's faces was instantaneous. "Cops, we gotta get out of here," one of them hissed, his eyes darting toward the pickup truck. "Not without him," another protested, gesturing to their leader, who was still pinned beneath Duke. The leader's cries turned desperate. "Don't leave me, get me out of here." But his pleas fell on deaf ears as the others scrambled toward the truck, abandoning him to his fate. The vehicle roared to life, tires screeching as it sped away, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Eleanor stepped closer, her hand firm on Duke's leash. "Seems like your friends decided you weren't worth the trouble," she said, her tone razor sharp. "You don't get it," the man stammered, sweat pouring down his face. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "What wasn't supposed to happen?" Eleanor demanded, her anger rising. "You threatening a woman and thinking there'd be no consequences. You've made your choices, and now you're going to face them." The red and blue lights of a police cruiser bathed the scene in an eerie glow. Officer James Carter stepped out of the car, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon as he approached cautiously. "Mrs. Davis," he called out, his voice steady. "Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, her grip on Duke's leash unyielding. "We're fine." Officer Carter. Duke made sure this one didn't go anywhere. Carter's eyes flicked to the trembling man pinned beneath Duke. "Good boy, Duke," he said with a small nod before addressing the man. "Stay still, pal, unless you want to make this worse for yourself." The man's voice cracked as he whimpered, "Get this dog off me." "Not until you're cuffed," Eleanor said firmly, her expression unyielding. Carter quickly secured the man's hands behind his back. "Okay, Mrs. Davis, you can call him off now." "Duke, release," Eleanor commanded. Duke obeyed instantly, stepping back with a low growl still rumbling in his throat. Eleanor knelt beside him, running her hand along his sleek coat. "Good boy," she murmured. "You did so well." The man groaned as Carter hauled him to his feet. "Where'd your buddies go?" the officer asked. "They left me," the man mumbled, his eyes downcast. "Smart decision," Carter muttered before turning to Eleanor. "We'll handle it from here, Mrs. Davis. Are you sure you're okay?" Eleanor stood tall, her hand resting protectively on Duke's head. "We're fine now, but I want to make sure this doesn't happen again." "It won't," Carter assured her as he led the man to the cruiser. "Not if I have anything to say about it." As the police car drove away, Eleanor exhaled deeply, her resolve unbroken. She glanced down at Duke, who wagged his tail and leaned into her side. "Come on, boy," she said softly. "Let's go home." Later that evening, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of chamomile tea cradled in her hands. Duke lay at her feet, his ears twitching occasionally as if still on alert. Her thoughts raced as she replayed the day's events. The men's hateful words lingered in her mind, but so did the image of Duke's fierce loyalty and the neighbor's security camera capturing everything. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was Officer Carter. "Mrs. Davis," he greeted her, his voice steady. "I wanted to let you know, we've got the man your dog apprehended in custody. We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a full statement." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. "Of course," she replied firmly. "I want to see this through." The next day, Eleanor arrived at the police station, her steps measured and purposeful. Duke stayed home to rest, but she carried his steadfast presence with her like armor, Officer Carter greeted her at the front desk and led her to a small interview room. "Thanks for coming in," Carter said, gesturing for her to take a seat. He set a clipboard on the table and sat across from her. "We've got Brian Tanner in holding. He's not saying much, but if you're willing, you can have a word with him before we take your statement." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You're saying I can talk to him?" Carter nodded. "Within reason, sometimes hearing directly from the victim can shake them up a bit. Just know I'll be right there." Eleanor hesitated for a moment before squaring her shoulders. "Take me to him." A guard escorted Eleanor into the holding area where she found Brian sitting in a small, stark room. His arm was in a sling, and his earlier arrogance had been replaced by a sullen, defensive demeanor. Eleanor stepped inside, her heels clicking against the floor, and met his gaze with a calm yet unyielding expression. "So, Brian Tanner," she said evenly, "that's your name?" He leaned back in his chair, attempting a smirk that fell flat. "What do you want?" Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "I want to understand what made you think you could get away with threatening me. Did you think no one would stand up to you? Or did you think I wasn't worth standing up for?" Brian's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "We didn't hurt you. Why are you making this a big deal?" Eleanor's voice hardened. "A big deal? You stalked me, threatened me, and tried to rob me in broad daylight. Do you think that doesn't matter? Or is it that you thought I didn't matter?" Brian looked away, tapping his fingers against the table. "We just wanted the necklace. That's all. It wasn't personal." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Not personal. You looked at me and decided I was an easy target because of my age and the color of my skin. If that's not personal, I don't know what is." Brian's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Eleanor leaned closer, her voice steady and sharp. "You thought no one would care. You thought you could intimidate me and walk away with no consequences, but you were wrong. And now, you're going to answer for it." Before Brian could respond, the door opened, and Officer Carter stepped in. "That's enough," he said gently, nodding to Eleanor. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis." Eleanor stood, her gaze lingering on Brian. "You chose this path," she said firmly. "Now you'll face where it leads." As she left the room, her resolve remained unshaken. The fight for justice was far from over, but Eleanor Davis wasn't one to back down. Eleanor's firm voice cut through the courtroom, addressing the defense attorney's insinuation. "Duke acted to protect me from an unprovoked attack. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here today. Those men escalated the situation when they decided to threaten me and my safety." The room grew silent, the weight of her words settling heavily. Even the defendant seemed to shrink under Eleanor's unwavering composure. Jessica Nguyen stood and redirected the focus, emphasizing the deliberate actions of the men and how their choices led to the confrontation. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented a seamless case. Security footage captured the men closing in on Eleanor, their body language oozing intimidation. Duke's fearless defense brought audible gasps from the jury as they watched the events unfold on the screen. Officer Carter testified next, describing the suspect's arrest and their uncooperative behavior. His testimony reinforced the calculated nature of the attack and the defendant's attempts to avoid accountability. Jessica brought attention to the underlying prejudice that motivated the crime. These men didn't just target Mrs. Davis because she was alone. They believed she was powerless, an older black woman they thought no one would care about. They were wrong. The defense struggled to counter. Their argument that the men acted out of desperation crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Jessica pressed hard during cross-examinations, dismantling any claims that the actions were impulsive or harmless. When Michael Mick Lewis took the stand, his nervous demeanor contrasted sharply with the confidence of his testimony during police questioning. He admitted to being the driver, claiming he didn't want anyone hurt. Jessica's questioning forced him to admit he willingly drove the group to the scene and stayed while they confronted Eleanor. "You didn't stop them, did you?" Jessica asked pointedly. Mick shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. In her closing argument, Jessica addressed the jury with conviction. "This isn't just about Mrs. Davis and what happened that day. It's about sending a message that targeting someone because of their perceived vulnerability, because of their race, their age, or their gender, is unacceptable. These men thought no one would care about Mrs. Davis, but they were wrong. Justice is about proving them wrong." The jury deliberated for hours, but the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all charges, relief washed over Eleanor as the judge delivered the sentence, ensuring that the men would face significant consequences for their actions. After the trial, Eleanor stepped outside the courthouse to a crowd of supporters and reporters. Jessica stood by her side, a symbol of justice and solidarity. Duke, now a local hero, waited at home, but Eleanor spoke with his spirit in her heart. "To anyone who feels powerless or ignored," she said into the microphones, Know this: your voice matters, and standing up for yourself is never in vain. These men underestimated me, but today we showed them what strength truly looks like. The applause that followed was deafening. Eleanor returned home to Duke that evening, her steps lighter, but her resolve unchanged. Justice had been served, but she knew her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who had ever been told they didn't matter. Sitting on her porch with Duke at her side, she whispered, "We did it, boy." His tail wagged, a silent promise that together they could face anything. The courtroom grew silent as the last day of the trial reached its pivotal moment. Eleanor Davis sat in her usual seat, her posture straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. The air in the room was heavy with anticipation, each person waiting for the jury to return with their decision. Across the room, Brian Tanner sat hunched at the defense table, his earlier arrogance long gone. His co-defendants, James Foley and Kyle Mercer, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes avoiding contact with anyone. Mick Lewis sat apart from them, his cooperation with the prosecution earning him both disdain and distance from his former allies. Judge Anita Reynolds entered the courtroom, her presence commanding instant silence. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable, carrying the weight of the verdict. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm, a picture of resilience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreperson, a composed middle-aged woman, rose with a paper in her hand. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded the document, her voice steady. "In the case of the state versus Brian Tanner, James Foley, Kyle Mercer, and Michael Lewis, we find the defendants guilty on all charges, including attempted robbery, assault, and harassment." A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Relief washed over Eleanor, though her expression remained composed. Justice had prevailed. Judge Reynolds nodded solemnly, her tone measured as she addressed the defendants. "Your actions were deliberate, malicious, and rooted in prejudice. You targeted Mrs. Davis not only for her possessions, but because you believed she was vulnerable and insignificant. This court will not tolerate such behavior." Turning her attention to Brian Tanner, the ringleader, she continued, "Mr. Tanner, you orchestrated this crime. For your leadership role in this act, you are sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. Tanner's face fell, his bravado utterly shattered. "James Foley and Kyle Mercer," the judge said, "you willingly participated, escalating the situation to a dangerous level. You are each sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with no parole eligibility for 6 years. Foley dropped his head into his hands while Mercer stared blankly ahead, his face pale. Finally, Judge Reynolds addressed Mick Lewis. "Mr. Lewis, your decision to cooperate with the prosecution has been noted. However, your involvement in this crime still holds weight. You are sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 3 years." Mick nodded faintly, his shoulders slumping in resignation. With her final words, Judge Reynolds issued a firm reminder. "Let this serve as a message that targeting individuals with malicious intent, driven by prejudice or entitlement, will have consequences. This court is adjourned." Her gavel struck with finality, echoing through the room. As the defendants were led out in handcuffs, Tanner shot a glance over his shoulder at Eleanor, his expression a mixture of anger and defeat. Eleanor met his gaze unflinching, before turning her attention back to Jessica Nguyen, the prosecutor who had fought so passionately for her case. "It's done," Jessica said, her voice warm with satisfaction. "We did it." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "Justice was served," she replied simply. Outside the courthouse, a small group of neighbors and supporters had gathered. Some approached Eleanor to offer words of encouragement, while others hung back, their discomfort with the publicity evident. Eleanor accepted their words with quiet dignity, her focus already shifting to the peace she sought to reclaim in her life. Returning home that evening, Eleanor was greeted by Duke's wagging tail and joyful bark. She knelt to embrace him, her hands running through his soft fur. "It's over, Duke," she murmured. "We did it." Duke nuzzled her hand, his unwavering loyalty shining in his eyes. Eleanor stood and moved to the kitchen, preparing a special meal for her steadfast companion. She roasted chicken to perfection, adding rice and carrots, and served it with care. Duke devoured the feast with gusto, his tail wagging furiously. As the evening deepened, Eleanor settled into her favorite armchair, Duke resting contentedly at her feet. The quiet hum of the house enveloped her, a stark contrast to the tension of the courtroom. She reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The attack had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also reaffirmed her strength and resolve. The trial had been more than just a fight for her own justice. It was a stand against the prejudice and entitlement that emboldened those men to believe they could act without consequence. Eleanor had faced their hatred head-on and emerged victorious, her courage and dignity intact. She glanced at Duke, his head resting on his paws as he watched her with calm, trusting eyes. "You're my hero, Duke," she said softly. "I couldn't have done this without you." Later, she clipped Duke's leash to his collar and stepped outside into the cool night air. The street, once the scene of fear and confrontation, now felt peaceful and safe. As they walked, Eleanor allowed herself to savor the moment, each step a testament to her resilience. The stars above seemed brighter, the world quieter, as though the storm had finally passed. Returning home, Eleanor prepared for bed. The weight of the ordeal lifting with each passing moment, Duke settled into his spot by the couch, his new toy between his paws. While Eleanor climbed into bed with a contented sigh, justice had been served, and the life she and Duke had reclaimed stretched ahead of them, full of hope and promise.